Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to my workshop today. The workshop's called From Conflict to Cooperation, and our focus will be on conflict in engineering organizations, techniques for conflict resolution, and conflict avoidance in general. So while I go through a brief introduction, I'd like everyone to follow along with your ears as you stand up, stretch a bit, maybe walk a few paces around the room, get your blood moving. I know this is the last workshop of the day. So maybe do a couple jumping jacks, maybe stretch a little bit, raise your heart rate, kind of elevate your attention, your energy level, get ready to wrap up the day, and maybe cap off in a couple hours with a couple pints for sure, if you'd like. Now, a bit about myself. My name is Jordan Adler. I'm the head of developer engineering at OneSignal, as well as an ambassador for All0. In my role as head of developer engineering, I have the opportunity to develop processes and set technical strategy for OneSignal. Previously, I've evolved engineering productivity at Cruise and at Pinterest. I led API platform engineering at Pinterest. I was a strategic partner engineer and developer advocate at Google. At Google, I had the opportunity to experience all sorts of conflict. In my role as a manager of technical partnerships between major organizations in Google, as well as setting developer relations strategy and go-to-market strategy from a technical perspective for a number of products in the Google Search, Chrome, and Android kind of product areas. So these conflicts were caused by a variety of reasons. We'll get into some of those later. And in addition to this lived experience, I've had the opportunity to prepare this workshop through research in the fields of management science, human behavioral biology, industrial organizational psychology, conflict theory and interpersonal sociolinguistics, business ethics, negotiation theory, game theory, communication theory, and occupational health psychology. My hope is that I can distill this knowledge into the next couple hours to prepare each of you to be effective in applying that theory to the software engineering organizations of which you are a significant and meaningful part. Now, for a quick sense of the audience, could you do me a favor and raise your hand, either physically? I think Zoom has a little reaction button. I'm going to try raising my hand. Raise your hand if you've ever been in a conflict. We've all been in conflicts, I think. That's good. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and lower my hand. Okay. Now raise your hands if you've ever been ever had a conflict resolution training of any kind. If you've been kind of done any kind of conflict resolution training or any sort of conflict mediation experience. Okay, cool. So we're all pretty well experienced in having conflicts and not so experienced in resolving conflict, and that's okay. That's fairly normal. So to give you a sense of how this workshop will break down, we'll start by going over kind of the context of the kind of meta on this workshop. Then we'll get into some brief overview of the central nervous system and the acute stress response, which underlies human emotions and behavior in conflicts. We'll practice with a quick guided meditation exercise that you can take with you and practice on a daily basis. Then we'll cover kind of conflict theory and conflict in the workplace generally. We'll do a quick digression into nonviolent communication, which is a set of communication techniques for understanding the unmet needs that can be hidden motivators for folks' behavior. Often people don't immediately understand the reasons why they may feel upset, and this toolkit will enable you to effectively identify and work towards resolving those unmet needs. After the lecture, we'll break into groups and practice using nonviolent communication in a brief exercise. Then we'll take a quick break and move right into conflict resolution. And that portion of the workshop will focus on what to do when a conflict has already occurred and leverages some of the therapy jargon we've picked up along the way. We'll break out into the groups again and role play as two engineers and an engineering manager looking to resolve a conflict in motion. And then we'll pivot to my favorite part of the workshop, where we discuss how to apply the knowledge that we've gained in conflict management theory to avoid conflict in the first place. In my opinion, this is the most important part of the workshop. And if you're not too mentally fatigued to take something back with you to apply at work, that's the good stuff. There will be notes, as noted. I'll share my lecture notes, so you will have the opportunity to go through this. Finally, we'll open the floor to an open conversation where folks can share the experiences that they've had and supplement the material we've covered with their lived experiences as well. I'm really excited for that part of the conversation because I'm sure I'll have a chance to learn. As a quick note, this is the first full run of the workshop that I've done. So I'd invite any of you and to share any feedback you may have on how to improve the exercise. I think I've laid out some of my primary objectives with the workshop. So if there's anything I might have missed or glossed over in the details or need to unpack more clearly to enable you to be effective in avoiding conflicts primarily and resolving it secondarily, I'd love to get your perspective. Now on to some brief behavioral biology. Some of you may remember from biology class that the nervous system is the portion of the body that manages communication, automatic function, and executive function. It's broken down into two parts: the central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord, and these elements process and disseminate information. These elements, so the other component is the peripheral nervous system, which acts as a bridge between the central nervous system and the body. And one key component of this is the autonomic nervous system. This portion of the body is built up of three components, two of which kind of act in opposition to each other, which are the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic, so I'm getting kind of giving you a big picture and digging deep into the specifics here. The sympathetic nervous system activates a broad set of functions that occur when the body is excited, when you do jumping jacks, when you move around, when you see something in the environment that maybe startles you or scares you. That's the sympathetic nervous system working. The parasympathetic nervous system, by contrast, activates a broad set of functions that occur when the body is at rest. These are often called the rest and digest or feed and breed activities and include a host of bodily functions you probably wouldn't want to be engaging in if you found yourself in a dangerous situation. Both systems are always running at some baseline level to engage in the ongoing homeostasis of bodily functions. However, signals from the brain can tilt the balance of activity from one system to the other. The second notable human biological subsystem for our purposes are the HPA and HPT axes of the neuroendocrine system. These are two of the four major parts of the endocrine system, the neuroendocrine system, which are made up of components of the brain and the central nervous system, as well as endocrine organs such as the parathyroids and hyperparathyroids. Thyroid and parathyroid. And pituitary. These three components, the HPA axis, the HPT axis, and the autonomic nervous system broadly, are the physiological elements that undergird the stress response, which is really the thing that we're concerned about at the moment. So before we move into the next abstraction layer and discuss the stress response, it's worth noting that there's a lot I haven't talked about with some of these biological systems. There's a long chain of evolutionary history that have developed these systems in ways that could enable you to be more effective in understanding and managing the behaviors of yourself and others, such as what time of day to engage in difficult conversations, when, for example, there are many psychological tricks that are based on leakiness and this abstraction. Handing someone a hot beverage when you're about to kind of try and ask them for something is a way to utilize some components of the system to maximize outcome. So moving on to the stress response, which is the core focus of our biological section of the lecture. The biological function, this biological function of the stress response regulates an organism's response to a stressor, such as a perceived signal of a threat in the environment. Much has been said about the stress response in general. I won't go too deep. On a high level, it floods the body with neurotransmitters, or the brain with neurotransmitters, necessary to trigger one of a number of knee-jerk reactions. We call these the Fs. Sometimes you'll hear it called fight or flight response, but there's actually a broad range of different responses. And these include fight, flight, faint, fawn, and freeze. Now, I'm sure you can imagine what fighting looks like in professional settings, like argumentation, yelling, things like that, rude remarks. Fainting, sometimes called flopping, is unlikely to occur in professional contexts, but is part of a common stress response. Freezing often looks like shutting down, total or partial non-engagement, and is quite common, in fact. And the fawn stress response in nature looks like rolling over, but in the workplace, it's a hidden submission to intimidation. So it's also suboptimal kind of outcome in stress response and in engaging in conflict. We'll get into some of the different strategies for engaging in conflict later, but the stress response can nudge people towards one of these suboptimal strategies. This well-evolved defense physiology is a common cause of interpersonal conflict, as well as a barrier to resolving conflict. There are a number, like any perceived psychological barrier to professional goals can trigger the stress response and cause folks to behave in a non-cooperative fashion. It doesn't take, a dangerous animal or someone kind of shaking you to trigger the stress response. If you're working towards a goal and there's something in your way preventing you from achieving that goal, whether that's, policy or individual kind of decision-making, that can create and trigger the stress response. It's also a common cause of ineffective work behavior in group settings, as colleagues can fawn or freeze in response to the stressful behavior of a coworker. And when we talk about psychological safety at work, we're talking about eliminating the triggers of these behaviors and encouraging full participation by all members of the organization. So if you have one takeaway from the portion of the workshop, let it be this: the stress response naturally occurs. It's bad for our work, and you can use your thought to retrain your brain's response to environmental signals and to either intentionally excite or calm your autonomic nervous system and manage your stress response. You may wish, for example, to increase your focus and processing speed by exciting your autonomic nervous system with short, rapid breaths or maybe bursts of physical activity. In fact, that's the objective that I had kind of earlier in this lecture when I asked you to step up and get moving. It's kind of elevate your central nervous system and excite your body overall. More likely, however, you may wish to calm your nerves with slow, deep breath and reduced processing of environmental stimuli. Let's get at a quick practice with a little guided meditation. I'd like you to sit in a comfortable, relaxed, but upright posture. Straighten your upper body. Place your arms parallel to the ground. Drop your chin just a bit. Close your eyes and follow your breath in and out for a moment. Breathe in slowly and deeply as you can through your nose. Hold it for as long as you can and release it all slowly through your mouth. And keep it out as long as you can. Let's repeat this process a few times. And observe as you feel your heart resting and breath shallowing as you continue to breathe in deeply. Do you feel like your heart rate is kind of lower? You feel more calm and at ease? This is part of the process of triggering that autonomic nervous system to create calm and depress the excitement that is naturally occurring. Now, in this course, I've asked you to take physical steps to bend your autonomic nervous system to your will. And with meditative practice, you can eventually manage your autonomic nervous system through executive function with thought alone. You can choose to lower or raise your heart rate. People often talk about these expert monks who can kind of, with only a thought, increase their heart rate or decrease their heart rate and survive, freezing scenarios. But the reality is anyone can achieve that with years of meditative practice. And it really doesn't take much. You can even retrain your body's automated response to environmental stimuli through a variety of techniques, often called cognitive behavioral therapies. These techniques enable you to recognize elements of your environment and change the automatic processing that subconscious elements of your brain engage in when they see this, to either increase, to respond either through calming or excitement. So keep this in mind as we move on. Everyone is capable of developing themselves to manage their emotional state in the workplace and be a productive and effective member of your engineering organization. Even clinically significant biological causes of behavior that cause conflict can be addressed either through treatment with a medical professional or cognitive behavioral therapy and other techniques. With enough empathy and effort, we can all learn to work together effectively. And if there are barriers that are causing us to behave in excited emotional states, we can overcome them together, either through kind of cooperation, meditation, and other techniques. So I'm going to go ahead and pause there. And that covers kind of the bulk of what I wanted to talk about in terms of the biological components. And I'd love to just kind of open the room to conversation. I know some folks have had some chat. I'd love to get some questions and any thoughts that folks might have. Cool. Let's move into a little bit of conflict theory. So we're moving on to our second lecture of the workshop, conflict in the workplace. So in the conflict transformation school of thought, which is one kind of philosophy for conflict theory, conflict is defined as a natural process of achieving harmony. David Anderson Hooker is one of the precepts of the school of thought and defines conflict as two ideas sharing space, two intentions sharing space. Diana Francis, also in the school of thought, defines conflict as the friction caused by difference, proximity, and movement. And under this perception, conflict is not violent, but rather a natural sociological process of cooperation within a system where diverse ideas and intentions exist in a complex web of interconnection. So that is true certainly for any workplace, but also society at large. Now let's start talking about, if we're going to focus on a workplace, let's start talking about how an optimal and healthy workplace should function. In a healthy workplace, nonviolent, non-judgmental conflict is occurring and reoccurring on a regular basis. I often think about engineering organizations as being teams of teams of teams. It doesn't have to be an engineering organization. Really, any organization is teams of teams of teams. And you can visualize it in your mind's eye as a tree of vectors. So you have maybe an org chart, and at the top, you have your CEO, and to each of the CEO, each function reports, maybe legal, product, engineering, and so on, sales and marketing. And each of these missions, each of these teams or functions is a vector, right? It is an arrow in space pointing at a particular direction with a certain level of magnitude behind it. So it has magnitude and direction. It has power and purpose. And each of these teams' purpose or power, let's probably talk about the magnitude first. Each of these teams' magnitude is a sort of operational power. Teams with more resources, power, or operational effectiveness can have more magnitude. We'll dig into that a little bit more in a moment, but I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about direction. So direction is, ultimately, ideally, a team has a clear and concise mission statement. And that mission is the direction of our vector. For example, a legal team might want to focus on keeping the company from, experiencing lawsuits, right? That is their direction. And they may have an amount of power behind that, depending on the power imbued by them organizationally through the CEO, as well as the number of people they have kind of working towards that mission. Now, ideally, these mission statements are what we call MISI, which is mutually exclusive and comprehensively exhaustive. So think about an engineering organization. We'll drill in deeper within a single function. An engineering team might break itself down into back end and front end. Well, that's fairly mutually exclusive, right? If you're building a certain kind of product and only has a back end and front end, there's nothing else to cover. There's no gaps in mission statement. It's also comprehensively exhaustive. It covers everything there is to cover in the space. This means that, it's mutually exclusive, meaning they don't have overlapping kind of functionality. So that MISI objective means that no layer of abstraction, whether it's at the, generally within a function, because functions themselves, at the top level functions themselves necessarily are MISI, but below the functional level, you'd hope that the layers of abstractions are non-overlapping and do not create gaps that can cause, failure to achieve missions. So the missions will be in conflict with each other. That's okay. An organization should create balance. And the product of an organization is a vector that is a product of all the vectors underneath it, the tree of vectors that align together into a single arrow pointing in space in a particular way. So let's go back to our example of a legal team. They might wish to protect the company. And a product team, a specific product team, might be focused on developing tax software. So if either side has full power of the organization, myopically focused on their mission, it'll result in bad outcomes. Developing tax software without consideration for the protection of the company will undoubtedly result eventually in company-killing lawsuits. Total protection of the company without consideration for the development of new software products will result in stagnation and eventually also the death of the company. So I'm sure we can find examples of both fail cases in the annals of history. And I'm sure there's cases where organizations right now are zombies and they're dead and it's playing out in real time in the marketplace. But when these teams cooperate, however, they balance their missions and work on behalf of the greater organizational good. In order to achieve that, they have to engage in constructive conflict. This healthy conflict is necessary to resolve alignment of these vectors and is governed by processes that can either be perfectly documented or totally illegible. Successful organizations, frankly, can appear both ways. There's not a strong correlation between success and robust. I mean, there is a correlation, but it's not super strong, right? There's lots of organizations out there that are successful in spite of how poorly things are managed kind of behind the scenes. Organizations that do not have clear and well-defined processes for mission cooperation between their functions will result in inefficiencies in interpersonal conflict. The other kind of conflict you have in mind when you probably sign up for this workshop, and most folks think about when they think about conflict, is destructive conflict. That's a kind of unhealthy disagreement that results in stress for workers and leads to an environment of psychological unsafety. Psychologist Daniel Katz has developed a model for sources of conflict and outlined 3 primary root causes: economic, value, and power conflict. Economic conflict is caused by constrained resources. In our settings, these can take multiple shapes. Perhaps a recruiting team is understaffed and has to split its time between multiple stakeholders, such as sales and engineering. If the engineering leader, sales leader, and recruiting leader fail to create balance that is in the best interest of the organization writ large, that'll result in conflict that is not resolved constructively and disempowers the overall organization. Perhaps an organization is cash strapped and has to decide which engineering teams to focus on and which ones to cut. Perhaps the CFO of a large multinational has set headcount growth caps for the company's divisions, and each division head has to divvy up amongst their group leaders as they see fit. This can be a source of economic conflict. Value conflict involves incompatibility between team ideologies or principles. So I'll give you an example from my Google days. Google Search and Google Chrome may both seek to influence the direction of the web itself, but do so with kind of different objectives and values in mind. Ideally, the organization overall is structured in a way to resolve these differences, but it's not always the case. It's not necessarily optimal or possible for total value alignment to exist within an organization. Values are often driven by the leaders, but they can also simply be emergent properties resulting from the consensus of the kinds of employees that would want to work on that project. Surely the kinds of people who want to work for Google Ads and the kind of people who want to work for Google Chrome have different values. Even if their leaders sought to create alignment by standardizing company values, some differences would necessarily arise, and interpersonal value conflict can occur. Power conflict is the third of these, and it can occur when a party seeks to increase its level of power relative to another, and often engages in behavior that increases or reduces power, like increases their own power or reduces the other's power. It's a bit more abstract and can take many forms, and often you have to kind of look at things over a long timeline to see this happen. So if you consider our tree of vectors model of organizations, this is when a particular vector tries to increase its own magnitude by appearing more effective or making another vector decreasing its magnitude by causing it to appear less effective. For example, a product management team of a sub-brand of a car manufacturer, Ford Pinto, might withhold information from a centralized operational recall team in order to prevent a recall that would have negative PR for the sub-brand. That negative PR would reduce the power of the product management team of that sub-brand and may even be an existential threat to the team itself. That behavior may be precipitated by calls from the sales team to close the brand due to poor sales. When faced with an existential threat, folks can often engage in poor behavior and power conflict. Now, each of these conflicts root causes can occur at any level of an organization. I've talked a bit about intergroup dynamics, but there's others as well. At the lowest of the branch of tree, we have interpersonal conflict, which is between individuals and takes many shapes. Interpersonal economic conflict, for example, could appear as two or more engineers needing access to a shared machine learning training server. The conflict can be exacerbated by additional situational factors such as looming project deadlines or personal life stress. It could easily be resolved by provisioning another server, but that's not always available as an option. Maybe it takes a lot of time, is expensive, or not an effective use of resources. Interpersonal value conflicts is the result of differences in personal values. Often they're not necessarily values in the absolute sense. For example, most people would say that they value transparency and that they value kindness. However, an individual preference for transparency over kindness may result in a communication style that's very blunt and direct. Relative to another preference for kindness over transparency, critical feedback from that party may appear as brash or excessive and result in interpersonal conflict. Interpersonal power conflict can take many shapes also, and also can be subtle and insidious. For example, as leaders often rely on secondhand information, individuals can report actions of behaviors of others that are colored by their interpersonal power conflict. This can even happen subconsciously. For example, if a worker perceives another worker as competitive for future leadership opportunities that they are seeking, they may seek to increase their likelihood of success through flattery of leadership or engaging in domineering behaviors in group settings by stealing the mic or doing other kinds of things that are silly power games that often come up, unfortunately. Next up is intergroup conflict that we've been discussing this far. We've talked about kind of team level or function level, but really it can happen at any level of abstraction within an organization chart. It can occur even between distant teams conflicting with each other indirectly as well through some shared resource. Finally, there's interorganizational conflict, which looks outside of our tree of vectors kind of mindset and encountered and kind of thinks about two separate trees engaging with each other. It's often encountered in partnership functions. So if you engage in kind of partner engineering or sales engineering, you may see this kind of conflict. So let's talk about how economic or value conflict might look like, or power conflict might look from an interorganizational context. So a timely example of interorganizational economic conflict might be the competitive actions and even lawsuits filed between Blue Origin and SpaceX as they both compete for the award of NASA government contracts. The conflict can spill over into other domains. Elon Musk taking pot shots on Twitter towards Jeff Bezos, is a result of this interorganizational economic conflict. Another example would be the bid to take over the radio spectrum that's made available by the transition from analog television to digital television radio waves. So the FCC regulates the usage of the radio spectrum and created the bidding process specifically because interorganizational economic conflict is necessary. It's necessitated by the fixed nature of the radio spectrum. And without regulation, the airwaves would suffer from a sort of tragedy of the commons because anyone could do whatever they want and there would be constant chatter and no one would be able to enjoy kind of the benefits of that service and technology. Interorganizational value conflict is common. Consider how Facebook and Google view the web differently. When Google designs solutions for the web, it generally does so in a way that's consistent with its value of openness. And Facebook, however, is mostly mindful of its own values, which include growth at any means necessary as part of its kind of core corporate entity. So Facebook has instant articles, Google has AMP HTML as offerings. There are alternatives that have the same platform feature, but the differences in values between the organizations create differences in the solution and the technical design of the solution implemented. Another example is Google and Apple's collaboration as browser implementers in the standards bodies that manage new web APIs. Apple very much values secrecy in development as part of their goal to create and manage kind of the consumer experience and expectations. That's a core part of Apple's values. And that often butts up against Google and other participants in the web standards process preference for openness and transparency. Often you'll hear standard body participants complain that Safari withholds information about changes to proposed APIs until they've made the announcement of the kind of release available to consumers. Interorganizational power conflict is often complex to understand and requires a broad view of time and markets. Consider, for example, Apple's marketing itself as a privacy-minded phone offering. This isn't because Apple genuinely values privacy. If that were true, it wouldn't have been a focus only recently, and historical technical decisions would have appeared differently. Now, the reason that Apple focuses on privacy in their marketing is a consequence of the competition between Google and Apple in the mobile operating system market. And it's a way for Apple to suggest that the alternative, which is not stated, but essentially is Android, is not privacy conscious. Google really can't take a strong counterposition here because of its robust ads business. Never mind the fact that Apple is also competing in those same ads businesses, but it's so far behind in those markets that it can't be painted as a market leader and can get away with kind of causing or exacerbating this interorganizational power conflict in kind of the minds of consumers. Additionally notable is intercultural conflict. So this is more of kind of an exacerbation of other kinds of conflict and moves beyond the business world and into geopolitics or cultural differences of power, differences in value, power, and economics. Consider Google's complicated history with the People's Republic of China, or challenges in collaborating between open and direct Israeli business culture and hierarchical and deferent Japanese business culture. Now that we've discussed the locations and root causes of conflict, let's review some common areas of conflict, specifically in organizational settings. In healthy settings, conflict occurs at places where decisions are made that impact more than one party, and that can be at individual, group, or interorganizational level as well. There are three common areas in engineering organizations where this occurs: technical decision-making, policy decision-making, and process decision-making. Technical decision-making, things like what language do we use for this project? Policy decision-making can be things like what languages are even allowed to be used at this company, right? Or what times do people work and how do they coordinate with each other? Process decision-making is a bit more meta because processes outline how individuals are supposed to coordinate with each other, and deciding how to approach cooperation itself can be an area of conflict. Another sort of meta conflict zone is living with the decisions that have already been made, or deciding how frequently decisions can be revisited. Because you want organizations to be nimble and adaptable, it's often inappropriate for most decisions to be unrevisitable indefinitely. However, if a decision were to be constantly revisited, it can weaken the adherence to the decision and create conflict as choices, policies, or processes are questioned. So let's take our root causes and move a layer up to the most common causes of conflict. Not an exhaustive list, but in my experience, most conflict is caused by a few of kind of common factors. Perhaps the most frequent one that I see is folks viewing their work as a product extension of their identity. As craftspeople, we're often passionate and prideful in the work that we produce. However, that pride can make hearing and implementing constructive feedback challenging or hurtful. When folks say pride comes before the fall, this is what they're talking about. If you're unable to healthily actionalize feedback about your ugly baby, the organization itself suffers. Lack of effective communication is a common challenge as well. Creating alignment between individuals and groups requires that information be spread and absorbed across a wide range of the org chart. And if folks aren't clear, concise, and consistent with their communication, misalignment will occur and create conflict. Lack of effective leadership can also create conflict. Organizational leaders are not just authority figures imbued with power to resolve conflict and make decisions, but they're also personifications of the groups that they oversee. If they engage in petty power struggles or fail to correct bad behavior for which they are responsible, that will cause conflict to replicate within their organization. Lack of aligned values is another challenge. Without alignment in key areas, individuals and groups will naturally engage in value conflict because we live in a world of diverse values and individual and group preferences. Another cause of conflict is unresolved past conflict. Just as a flywheel of repeating successful execution of operational processes that resolve mission statements between functions can create a virtuous cycle of growth and innovation. Repetition of destructive conflict can create a vicious cycle that drags an organization into a culture that results in failure or loss of personnel. Any sort of change will introduce the possibility of conflict. As new decisions are made, people will reassess the validity of past decisions in the new world. Well, this is the technical choice that we made today, but yesterday we have a new policy on some matter, and maybe we should change what we're doing now instead. Sometimes people can unilaterally break from some part of the past as a secondary consequence of a change that was made. Finally, any form of stress, especially stress caused by change, can be conflict-inducing. As we find our chronic stress levels increase, our ability to self-regulate our emotions decreases. And this stress can create behavior that results in unhealthy conflict and can often spread virally. So we've covered quite a bit in the realm of workplace conflict, and I want to give a couple final thoughts before we jump into nonviolent communication and then kind of conflict resolution. Often when folks interview, I'll ask them, why did you leave the organization that you're looking to leave? And they'll say something like office politics. And I'll say, what do you mean, right? I usually try and dig deeper and understand what kind of conflict was occurring, why it was unhealthy, and why they were unable to make it constructive. Office politics is often a shorthand we use to refer to conflict and the silly games that humans can play when they engage in interpersonal power conflict. And so now that you have the language and tools necessary to deal with office politics, I would implore you to retire that term and be effective participants in constructive conflict and mission alignment. And by the way, if you're ever in an organization where you see people engaging in silly and stupid power games, vote with your feet, go somewhere else. There's no reason we should tolerate manipulative behavior from our colleagues and leaders, and understanding how conflict can be had healthfully and nudging folks towards them is key to building a culture of constructive conflict. So before we jump into non-violent communication, I'd like to just quickly open the floor if anyone has questions or anything to share. Okay, great. Let's take a quick digression from conflict itself to discuss a communication tool called nonviolent communication. Nonviolent communication is a strategy for understanding with a focus on avoiding judgment and maximizing compassion. It was developed by Dr. Marshall Rosenberg following his lectures and mediations during the process of integrating the public education system in the American South. NVC leverages mindfulness to enable us to speak neutrally but empathically about emotionally charged topics. It encourages us to observe without evaluating and identify and express the feelings and unmet needs that can create stress or friction in our lives. When our emotional pain might nudge us towards lashing out at each other and creating vicious cycles of conflict, NVC enables us to connect and build bridges towards common understanding. As a participant or leader in the workplace, you can leverage NVC to discuss the things that are emotionally charged or are challenging to hear or to say. In this lecture, we'll briefly go over some of the jargon and structure of NVC, but you can use these underlying principles to communicate colloquially about difficult topics. NVC emphasizes non-judgmentalness. If you find yourself jumping to conclusions as to why an individual may behave the way they do, pause and collect your thoughts. Ask yourself, in what world would a well-intended person behave this way? There are often many unknowns that contribute to the behavior of others, and it's hard to have an open mind when it's filled with conclusions. An NVC dialogue begins with a statement of observation. For example, I hear you raising your voice, or I see that your fists are clenched. Next, we extend our empathy to dig beyond that observation and guess at the emotional states that might be contributing to the behavior. For example, might you be feeling angry? Or are you deep in thought or perhaps feeling gloomy? One may need to follow a line of indirection to arrive at the correct underlying emotion. We might ask, are you feeling gloomy because you may be feeling lonely? Or maybe you're hurt? Once we've created a shared understanding of the emotional state, for example, loneliness, we may try to dig at the underlying need that may or may not be well fulfilled. We may ask, are you feeling lonely because you have an unmet need to be heard? We may use empathy to build a shared connection to help the individual feel safe and comfortable in sharing their inner thoughts. I might say, for example, personally, I can feel lonely sometimes at parties because I'm not very good at speaking in group settings and feeling heard. Especially if someone else is very boisterous, it can be difficult for me to get a word in edgewise and participate in the conversation. Finally, we can make a request for a plan of action to help meet that individual's needs. For example, we might ask, would it be okay if I asked your opinion in group conversations to help bring you into the fold? Or, is there a way I can tell you may have something to say and need help finding a break in the conversation? Or perhaps we'd say, would it be okay if I asked John to pause and let others speak in group settings? He may not realize how boisterous and domineering he's being. And that right there is the core of NVC. It's a 4-step process: observation, feeling, need, request. That 4-step process can be directed in dialogue outwardly or inwardly. So we've just covered an inbound communication where we draw information from another. Let's see how that might be applied when expressing oneself. I may say, for example, sometimes I see you going desk to desk to invite colleagues to after-work drinks. Often you'll pick a small group, and that doesn't always include me. That can make me feel lonely because I have a need to feel community with my coworkers, and this exclusion can make me feel like I'm not a part of this community. Would you be willing to include me more often when you organize after-work drinks? So again, this is a 4-step process: observation, feeling, need, request. It's not intended to be prescriptive in terms of the specific words used, nor is it necessary to be a true dialogue. You can actually use this approach internally in one's internal monologue to gain a better understanding of oneself and emotional states and create strategies for managing these emotions and ensuring your own needs are well met. As an exercise after this workshop, I would encourage you to expand your vocabulary of emotions by looking for resources online that enumerate the words that describe emotions. There's a broad range of nuance that are not well captured by feelings like sad or happy. Additionally, there are a lot of individual needs. So I've noted kind of community and self-expression, but there's countless others such as touch, authenticity, harmony, creativity, and so on. And ultimately, everyone has a need to feel like a person of value in a world of meaning. An NVC helps us create a world of meaning and ensure that all the persons in that world have their value recognized and optimized. So if you're curious to learn more about NVC, I'd recommend the book Nonviolent Communication. There's a lot of depth in this space, and exercising this muscle can help enable constructive conflict in the workplace and dismantle cycles of destructive conflict. Okay, let's talk about conflict management, conflict resolution. What happens when a conflict has happened and we have to intervene? So conflict management can be defined as the process of reducing negative outcomes of conflict while increasing the positive. Generally, when faced with conflict, individuals trend towards using one of a number of different approaches. Under the Thomas Kilmann model, these are avoiding, accommodating, competing, collaborating, and compromising. Don't worry about taking notes. You'll get lecture notes at some point. But so you can, we're going to have a lot of these kinds of models to talk about. So I'll just kind of go through and try and give you the key takeaways after we enumerate them. So the model is based on 2 dimensions of behavior that help characterize the 5 different conflict handling modes. The first dimension is assertiveness, which describes the extent to which a person will try to fulfill their own concerns. And the second is cooperativeness, which describes the extent to which a person will try to fulfill others' concerns. So the 5 conflict handling modes fall within these scale of 2 dimensions of assertiveness and cooperativeness. Avoiding has low assertiveness and low cooperativeness. And in this case, an individual tends to withdraw from the conflict, and therefore no one wins. They neither advocate for the concerns or the positions they hold, nor for the positions of others. They might ignore conflict or take a passive attitude in the hope the issue resolves itself. Avoiding conflict is rarely the best approach, but within the context of a multi-conflict setting, it might be beneficial to choose your battles. I would say generally avoiding is almost always suboptimal. The accommodating style has low assertiveness and high cooperativeness. So we're not advocating for one's own needs, but we are kind of interested and invested in the needs of others. The individual doesn't avoid the conflict altogether, but rather sacrifices their own needs to keep the peace and offer total kind of accommodation to the other's concerns. That peacekeeping does not result in harmony, as the full range of the solution space is ceded to the counterparty and no balance of needs is struck. The competing approach is high assertiveness and low cooperativeness. The individual fulfills their own concerns at the expense of others and uses powers at their disposal to win the conflict. Winning, however, is suboptimal because it fails to balance the needs of all parties. The compromising approach has moderate assertiveness, not too low, not too high, and moderative cooperativeness, not too low, not too high either, kind of a Goldilocks zone. Compromise is when neither party wins nor loses, but you often end up achieving suboptimal results by splitting the difference. The collaborating approach has high assertiveness and high cooperativeness. Both parties win the conflict by finding a creative middle ground that addresses as many needs as is possible. This approach results in generally optimal outcomes, but often requires a lot of resources to achieve effectively. There's an old parable of 2 children fighting over an orange. A wise elder encourages compromise by cutting the orange in half and giving each child an equal portion of the orange. The first child removes the skin from the orange, tosses it aside, eats the fruit, very happy and satisfied. The second child removes the skin from the orange, tosses away the fruit, and steeps the zest in their tea, happy and satisfied. Now, that would be a compromising approach, but a true collaborative approach to this conflict would have been both children getting everything they wanted. A full orange's worth of fruit and a full orange's worth of zest. The parable is a little weak because you don't want a full orange's worth of zest in your tea, but I think you get where I'm coming from. The conflict resolution modes we'll review today focus on a collaborating approach to drive an optimal outcome. It's not necessarily the case that this approach is always the right choice. It's typically more resource intensive to implement, but it does result in stronger relationships between both parties and greater adherence to outcomes. So you're much more likely to follow through with a shared plan of action if you collaborated toward developing that shared plan of action. Sometimes lesser conflicts will sort themselves out and can be resolved with little outside perspective or input, but more severe conflicts will need to be addressed in a proper manner. As an organizational leader or HR business person, if you're finding that conflicts are not resolving themselves, you may need to intervene. If the workplace is being disrupted, productivity being affected, or a threat is being posed to other employees, you'll need to intervene. If either party requests mediation, you'll also need to intervene. But whatever the case, you should always acknowledge and make a record of the problem and decide whether or not to intervene. And when you make that decision, there's a number of factors you can consider. Some of the things I noted before, as well as the number of people involved, the severity, the level of disruption, and the issues that are kind of core to the conflict. And so I'm going to go ahead and skip some elements in my lecture here about bases of power, and let's talk about approaches for mediation. So a mediator can take one of four approaches to engaging in conflict mediation. The four approaches are facilitative, formulative, directive, or manipulative. In the facilitative approach, as a third party, the mediator provides a light touch, merely acts as a neutral agent to manage the logistics of the mediation. In the formulative approach, the mediator takes a slightly more active role and assists parties in defining the problem itself, because oftentimes part of the problem in solving a problem is defining the problem and agreeing on where the problem ends and what problems are not related to the problem, and encourages the participants to take prospective solutions. A directive approach is one where the mediator takes a very active role, defines the scope of the problem themselves, and describes what kind of solutions might be appropriate and how to select one. And then finally, the manipulative approach is one where the mediator acts as a leader and uses their power to formulate an acceptable agreement and coerce or reward the parties into acceptance. So generally, the approach that you take will depend on the specifics of the mediation in question, what possible outcomes could happen without, if you take, ideally you take a more facilitative approach and you're not super prescriptive, but you may need to be more prescriptive depending on the efficacy of like how effective the mediation is going to be without your kind of involvement as a mediator. Now you'll want to engage in some preparatory tactics. And so we'll talk about some of the things you could do in the most robust approach. So in the most robust approach, you don't improvise. You try to be well prepared and well informed. You'll invite both parties, and as part of the invitation, you'll provide the benefits of mediation to both parties, introduce yourself as a mediator to all parties with the context provided. So you might say, I see myself as an impartial process, or I may have a particular bias here, but I can look past that. You might also highlight areas of technical expertise. I don't know much about this particular system, but I know about this adjacent system, and maybe, that can help me better understand the problem. The mediator should consider what individuals from parties should be present for success. So if you have kind of two different groups that are in conflict with each other, you may want to have a specific representative from each group, and you want to make sure that you're using the right representative. And finally, you should write all this down, document the process of preparation, and lay out the rules for engaging in mediation. So the mediator may choose to enter the mediation without any awareness, having done no research, in order to be kind of open-minded as possible. Other times, you may kind of choose to do your own research and come into the conflict prepared for mediation. Typically, in the most robust case, you may ask each agent or each party in the mediation to share their understanding of the situation, what requirements they may have for mediation, what questions they have for the other parties, so what they need to know, and what solutions might be acceptable. And oftentimes, you may have to do that under agreement of confidentiality. Ultimately, the mediator is responsible for logistics and should provide the physical meeting space for context. There's a lot of thought that goes into how to prepare a physical meeting space for conflict mediation. But generally, you'll want some sort of whiteboard so that you can kind of create and set kind of a shared understanding and use some kind of, brainstorming processes. And usually a round table is recommended because of the psychological benefit of having kind of everyone in an equal kind of footing and position. Now, the parties themselves should take steps to prepare. And in the kind of simplest form, they should decide what they want to say. So what they want to go into the mediation and say, what they don't want to say, so what they want to keep to themselves, and what they want to ask. So what kinds of things they want to know from the other party. There's a lot more complexity that you can do. There's a systematic approaches to review the people, the problem, and the processes. And, certainly in highly tense and, nation state negotiations and conflict mediations, there are many, many steps involved in the process and a whole lot of preparation that goes forward. I don't think too much of that's going to come into play for most of the folks in this room. But generally, mediation itself consists of one or more sessions of dialogue with quite a bit of preparation involved in the most robust case. But chances are we'll be doing a one-off session with some amount of preparation involved ahead of time, mostly by thinking about, what are we missing? What do we want to say? What do we want to know from the other party? And what kind of outcome are we looking to drive? So as a mediator, once the session begins, it's helpful to restate the ground rules and establish the context that enables everyone to overcome any barriers to healthy communication they have. Take a few steps to cultivate the kind of pragmatism necessary to generate an agreed settlement and to end the conflict. So try and soften the expression of high negative emotions when possible, but still allow people to express themselves. Emotionally charged statements can trigger a stress response. I would also be cautious to control any scope creep in terms of the issues and problems to be negotiated. Keep it focused on the problem at hand and relevant underlying context. Reestablishing some common ground between the groups concerned, such as shared principles or goals, is helpful. And if needed, and things look like they're not going to work and the mediation won't be successful, feel free to bail and kind of, pause the conversation and find a way to adjust the the mediation process itself so that constructive talks can resume. So as part of these processes, there are a number of techniques that can be used to better comprehend the cause of conflict. So essentially, once you've created a conflict resolution space, you do 3 steps. You create a shared pool of understanding by laying out all information that's possible. Then you kind of discuss possible solutions. And finally, you create a plan of action for addressing whatever solution is decided upon by both parties. Now, when it comes to creating that shared pool of meaning and comprehending the cause of conflict, there are a handful of tools that you can use. 3 common ones are called ABC, onion, and tree. I'm just going to talk about ABC quickly, although my lecture notes will go in depth on all 3. The ABC technique looks at the attitudes, behaviors, and contexts of the parties in conflict. And basically, the mediator will go on a whiteboard and create triangles for each person or each party, and then ask them to put in their attitudes, the behaviors, and context as they describe it themselves. And then the mediator so you do that for each party. So let's say there's 2 parties, you ask each one to put down, what have you been engaging in, why have you been engaging that, and what makes you feel that way. Next, the mediator kind of, after you do that for both parties, you look for the unstated need for each party. As you do attitude, behavior, and context, then you say, okay, what is the unmet need that you have here that underlies all of this? Maybe it's a need for harmony or something like that. You put that in the center. Then you'll do that for both parties and then compare each triangle against the stated perceptions of each counterparty. Oftentimes, the part of the problem is we come to conclusions about how the other party is feeling or what they're thinking or what their motivations are. And the triangle tool can help us see beyond that. The onion tool is kind of similar, uses concentric rings and looks at, instead of ABC, you look at, PIN, purpose, interests, and needs, but it's the same kind of thing. The idea is to illuminate commonality, difference, and consider how perspectives might be different from reality. So once you've developed using one of these techniques or any other kind of approach, simple conversation, if it's a sufficiently simple problem. You then focus on ways to get people, generally all of these approaches are intended to get people to shift away from their position or stated desired outcome to their actual underlying interests and needs. And it's not always easy because sometimes people don't know what their interests are. You'll need to guide them by asking them questions and using some of the NVC kind of techniques that we talked about before. You might ask them, why do you want this exactly? You want to make sure that people stick to the facts and not the emotions, not allow the emotions that they have to, cause them to draw conclusions. It's important to get them to move from their positions to their interests and then their interests to their needs. So once you have that identified and you have a shared pool of understanding, then you begin to discuss what are the possible solutions. Encourage both parties to come up with creative ideas that will satisfy as many of their combined interests as possible. The more options, the better. And at this point, maintain the focus on coming up with options, not evaluating the validity or acceptability of the different options. Keep those steps decoupled. Oftentimes, time can be a challenge here. So if you time box the session, you'll want to make sure to give enough time, more time than you expect, because if people feel rushed, they'll often fail to come up with the correct kind of creative solutions that are necessary. So taking the time to discover all the options openly will produce more solutions instead of right answers. And folks will often have hidden agendas. So push folks to move beyond their hidden agendas and towards the shared interests of the group itself. Finally, when you choose a solution, it's important to outline the features and benefits to both parties. Choose a solution that's critical when you do choose a solution, it's critical to ensure that folks understand what the next step is and who is responsible for what next step. Then you document that process and share that kind of shared plan of action, that documented shared plan of action on the whiteboard itself. When you have consensus between the group, you can then move forward. There's a lot of value in having that shared future be physically present in the space. It's an effective psychological tool for seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, or perhaps the writing on the wall, right? So when you're developing a plan to resolve the conflict, document the meeting in the minutes and the shared plan of action, share it out afterwards and give folks the opportunity to disagree or highlight and kind of misses in that documentation process, and then develop and follow through with the shared plan of change. So that's the core of conflict resolution and a conflict mediation process. Let's go ahead and try a little informal mediation exercise ourselves. I have a few things I want to touch on quickly before we wrap up. There's a whole lot more that I wanted to get to that I have lecture notes that you'll all have that unfortunately I'm not going to have time to do. I think I designed a 3-hour workshop thinking I was designing a 2-hour workshop, but I'll try and focus on a few of the key elements quickly in this next bit of lecture, and feel free to look through the notes later. Essentially, when it comes to conflict avoidance, early and often communication is key. When it comes to engineering organizations, there's 2 big places where conflict can happen. The first one is making technical decisions, particularly around software design. So having a clear software design process is important, and having a clear software design process that documents decisions made, the alternatives that were considered, so that folks know, hey, we thought about using C++ instead of Rust, and we decided not to, and we have a decent reason for it, and it's documented over here. Please stop bringing it up every time you see me, right? Another area where conflict often comes into play is in delivering critical feedback. Critical feedback is really important. It's the lifeblood of any successful organization. And oftentimes companies are deliberately developmental, so they want to give you critical feedback. They encourage people to give each other critical feedback, which is great because it helps us all get better. Not great because most people are quite poor at providing critical feedback. So I want to give you a few quick tips for, there's a whole lecture series alone you could do on delivering critical feedback, certainly, and many, many books written on the topic. But I'll give you a few quick notes. Generally, critical feedback should be delivered privately. Some organizations will encourage people to do it directly between peers, while others expect that it be delivered to an individual's manager who can then coalesce and deliver it appropriately. It's also important when delivering critical feedback to be specific, impersonal, actionable, and timely. If you're saying, if a specific feedback is when you do X, it has this consequence, right? As opposed to you are the kind of person who creates these consequences. Impersonal is also important, right? Being specific about the impersonal feedback says, hey, you're bad at doing X. Whereas personal says, impersonal feedback says, in this specific case, when you try to, do X, it didn't come out quite as you wanted. And actionable means, hey, don't tell someone, some sort of critical feedback that they can't do anything about. It's not effective. It's only going to hurt people's feelings, and it's not going to impact any meaningful change. Unactionable feedback, is not well-formed feedback. Timeliness is also important. You need to be delivering it quick, within a reasonable amount of time, so it's fresh in the memory of the minds of people who have it. Telling people 6 months later about something they did, they don't even remember, is not super helpful or actionable. It's also important to not use absolutist or judgmental terms. Rather than saying the problem is X and you should do Y instead, you might say an alternative approach to solving your problems might be to do Y. Generally, you want to translate complaints and criticisms into requests with a positive outcome. For example, instead of saying you're constantly late, you may say you've been late to a few meetings recently. I think making an effort to show up early for at least a little while will let folks know you're well prepared to collaborate. Generally, don't ever communicate from an angle of status. I am this and I need to demand that. If your feedback isn't well formed or doesn't take the full set into features and count, communicating from an angle of status will discourage others from pushing back against your feedback, which is important because you don't have all the information. You can't possibly have the information, and you want to develop a partnership and change. So with that in mind, I'd like to go ahead and open the conversation if folks have anything they want to share or add. Also want to remind you, please, to share any feedback you might have on this workshop. Certainly, I have some notes and takeaways to improve it, and I would love to get your perspective as well. And if you're curious to learn more about this topic, I'll share some notes on resources I'd recommend to dig deeper. And I'll be probably blogging. I mean, I've built so many lecture notes at this point, I might as well release a blog or two about this topic as well. Thank you all so much for coming. I hope this was helpful. I've taken your notes, and I'll go ahead and polish up these lecture notes and share them out to Kevin so he can pass them along to everyone who attended it as well. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter if you'd like to continue having contact and being a kind acquaintance of mine. I'll share those links too. Great. Thank you so much, folks. Have a great one.